I'm Kara Kennemer. I'm the chair of Historic Fort Worth. I want to welcome you all to the 20th Canny Lecture and Preservation Awards program. This year's Canny Lecture is a collaboration between key faculty and students at the University of Texas at Arlington and Historic Fort Worth. Students from Professor Cheryl A. Mitchell's class of Practice, Art, and Art History have hung the gorgeous photos of the Art Deco buildings in Fort Worth that were taken by the late Donald M. Cohen, and you'll see those around the room. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Kate Holliday is currently the Randall Bialis Professor of Historic Preservation and American Architectural History of Landscape Architecture at the University of Illinois. And she was also the founding director of the David Dillon Center of Texas Architecture while at UTA. She also established the Dillon Symposium to bring together scholars and experts from across disciplines to discuss issues related to architecture and urbanism in North Texas. So it's my pleasure to welcome her home. This is the second time that Dr. Holliday has utilized photos taken by the late Dr. Donald M. Cohen for Judith Singer Cohen's book, Cowtown Modern, The Lasting Influence of Art Deco Style. Dr. Holliday's topic for us this evening is Nowtown and Cowtown, Art Deco Architecture and a Modern Fort Worth. Now welcome Dr. Kate Holliday.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I moved away from Texas in August, and so I'm back, right? It wasn't very long. Didn't take too long to get back. And I kind of think of this as a little bit of a nice end cap to having spent 16 years here in North Texas. I'm going to reserve a few thoughts about what I feel like I've learned here for the end of the talk. So first, this title. I had a friend congratulate me on my incredible title. I'm like, I did not make this up, as many of you know. Nowtown and Cowtown was, especially in the 1970s, there was a big conversation in Fort Worth that many of you probably remember that had to do with what is the direction, what's the future for this city. This is a cartoon that was in the Star-Telegram in 1976. This image is from UT Arlington Special Collections. And you can see here, this is the building of the Tandy Center over there on the left, the building going up just to the left side of the cartoon. Lots of demolition taking place. And the caption here, especially if you can't read it there in the back, is I'd say our image is changing from Cowtown to Nowtown, right? And there were bumper stickers, I hear, that were on people's cars about Cowtown and Nowtown, and there was a lot of push back and forth. But in the 70s, Fort Worth was kind of going in this Nowtown direction. Modern architecture, kind of clear out the past, and let's think about it, what it means to be a modern city. These themes are still a really big part of how we're talking about the city today. Certainly relevant to historic preservation and a lot of other conversations going on, so that's where I'm borrowing this title from. But before we get there, there are basically three things that I'd like to try to do quickly. First is a little bit of background on Art Deco. Like, I think everybody here knows what Art Deco is, right? But like, I'm not talking to people who don't know this already, but I want to put it in a little bit of context. I want to think a little bit about technology, especially because it's something that's really interesting to me as a historian. And then last, I want to come back to this Cowtown and Nowtown idea and put this in local context. So first, Art Deco. An image like this kind of encapsulates the popular image of Art Deco. This is Margaret Bourke-White, the photographer over there on the left, in this kind of death-defying pose out on one of the gargoyles of the Chrysler building with her photography equipment, just in a place that I kind of wish I could go in her footsteps, but also I'm not doing it, right? But it's glamorous, right? She's dressed in this incredible outfit to go out to work, with the winds blowing through her hair up there in the skyline of Manhattan. And we have the cover of Vogue magazine from 1925, Life from 1926. We're at glamour, fashion, changing style and modernity, right? Those hemlines have come way up above ladies' knees. These are modern girls. And then, you know, the idea of decorative arts, that you can consume this new style and bring it home with you, right? It's your clothing, it's your shoes. It's a beautiful salt and pepper sets by the Danish silver maker George Jensen. It's Lalique, this beautiful crystal vase with these curvilinear forms, right? Art Deco is something immediate and personal and fashionable. The other piece of Art Deco that I think is really important is that this term, Art Deco, is not at all what designers and architects used for their own work in the 1920s and the 1930s when this work was being produced. They called their work modern, right? It was modern art. We came up with this term, or Bev Hillier came up with this term in 1960s in order to come up with a word for all of this stuff that happened in the 1920s and 30s and to lump it all together into one. And so when we're talking about Art Deco, it's a term that's created, again, in the 60s, and it's borrowed from the title of this exposition that took place in Paris in 1925, the Paris International Exposition of Decorative Arts. And I'm showing you a couple of posters and a brochure from that exhibition in 1925. And that exhibition, giving its name to a whole range of works done in the 20s and 30s, kind of compresses Art Deco into something that's about the way that it looks. It makes it a style. And there are some elements to that that are important to think about. This is the main causeway of that 1925 exposition, and you can see here the real variety of the pavilions along that main causeway. Some, as in the right foreground here, in this octagonal building, are kind of crystalline, stacked forms. Over there in the midground of the left, you can see that curvilinear, almost pyramidal form that looks a little bit like it's borrowed directly from an archaeological dig. And there's a huge kind of variety of architecture here. And that's one of the keys of Art Deco, is there's actually not one appearance of Art Deco. It's a huge range. It's very eclectic. And so I want to lay out basically three things that were really important for architects and designers as they thought about what Art Deco should be, and really created this brand new, modern, fashionable way of thinking. The first was archaeology, and borrowing forms that were being kind of newly rediscovered in the 20s as archaeological digs brought new artifacts to attention. This is a picture on the right of a discovery of Anubis from Tutankhamun's tomb from 1925. And the newspaper coverage there, treasure removed from Luxor tomb, right? Every new discovery was huge public fascination, and people were discovering, what did Egypt look like? What did archaeological remains from Central America look like? And so archaeology and new forms fueled designers. Second, and this probably isn't a surprise, going along with that was a general sense of exoticism, that designers in Europe and the US were very interested in forms from cultures outside of their own and in borrowing from them and appropriating from them into their own way of designing. So I'm showing you here the step pyramid from Tikal on the left, and over here on the right, this is a 19th century silk embroidery from China. And you can see those geometric forms of things like steps and crystals and fret patterns. And these abstracted cloud-like forms, the repeated geometric patterns of the waves, those kinds of things are interesting to designers also. Finally, and this piece kind of seems to come a little bit out of nowhere with the interest in archaeology and exoticism, but technology itself and abstracting the forms of technology was hugely important in thinking about Art Deco forms. This is, of course, the Hindenburg flying over Manhattan. And this juxtaposition of never before seen flying objects in the sky that seemed to come out of nowhere, with a skyline that seems to change daily, with skyscrapers rising up above the levels of the 19th century city. All of this came together to really shift the way that artists and architects thought about what modern art should be. And I want to focus just for a minute on that technological piece, and especially thinking about why technology and modernity really fueled some of this kind of conversation about what modern design should be. The first, and this may be kind of hard to remember when we think about this very fashionable jazz age, flapper girls, the beautiful forms of Lalique and silver design, is that the 20s in the US were actually typified as well by one of the periods of the greatest economic and industrial growth that the country has ever experienced. And so I'm showing you here, and if you can see this, can't see the pointer, but the low point on this graph, the bottom point, is the year 1921. The high point is the year 1929. And what we have in this period is an almost growth by 50% of the GNP per capita across that 9 years. And of course, when you see it plummet in 1929, that's the stock market crash of 1929, right? So there's this huge growth of industry and profit. And to go along with that, there is huge public interest in where that growth is coming from. So on the right, this is a photograph by Margaret Bourke-White that she took for Life magazine of a textile mill, right? Because people wanted to see the growing nature of industry in the country. Artists also went out into the industrial landscape and drew and printed and painted what they were seeing to allow people to take part. This is Demuth painting, of course, on the right. Train yards, grain silos, factories, water towers became the subject of art. On the left, this is a Paul Strand photograph. This is actually a Hollywood movie camera. So as people were going to the movies with their new income, people were also curious about how this technology worked. How did you produce a film? In the Queensboro Bridge and smokestack over there on the right. Along with this, just kind of general rise in industry and productivity, there is a rise in electrification. And again, I want to just point out quickly that blue line up on the top of this graph shows you the percentage of households with electricity. And it goes from about 35% of households in 1920 on the left having electricity to 70% by 1930. So a doubling of the number of houses in the US that had electricity. On the bottom in red is rural households, which is going to lag behind, of course, going from about 2% in 1920 to only about 10% by 1930. Right? So differences between the urban and the rural. And again, artists interested in what this looks like. Paintings of electricity, the infrastructure, photography of projects like the Hoover Dam that were intended to bring greater and greater amounts of electricity to places like Los Angeles, right? Capturing the public imagination. Because I am very interested in telephones, because I'm working on a project that I've been working on forever on the history of telephone buildings and infrastructure, I've tossed in telephone use, growing from 20% of households in 1920 to 40% by 1930. There's, again, fascination with the implements that we're using as these new technologies come into people's homes. Imagine you're a house that in 1920 didn't have electricity and didn't have a telephone, and 5 years later you have both. It's a huge change. And finally, the last, I promise it's the last graph, is just consumer goods. The things, if you've got electricity in your house, well, you probably need to buy things that use electricity, right? And they're certainly going to be marketed to you. And this graph in particular refers just to radios. So 0% in 1922. And by the end of the graph over there on the right, we have about 45% of households having a radio. And again, massive change due to technology, mass production. And what do these things look like, right? We're bringing things into the home that had never been there before. Beautiful bakelights, tabletop radio there on the left. My favorite is this Walter Doran Teague, beautiful circular radio that's actually 5 feet high. Right? If you haven't seen one of these before, it's my height, and I'm like, can I take this home with me and no one will notice, right? Incredibly beautiful pieces, but what is a radio supposed to be, right? This time period in the 20s and 30s is when this kind of addressing of what do household appliances look like? from a kerosene lamp over there on the left, that's kind of a 19th century technology, to over here on the right, Walter von Nessen, electrical lamp. I love this photograph because you see the cord coming out of the bottom, right? Streamlined, much more modern looking in order to show you a change has happened. And then, of course, cars. We could do a whole other thing on cars, but this is a 37 cabriolet that was just exhibited in Dallas a few years ago, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. And it's showing you how fast it is. It's showing you that it's modern. It's showing you that it's breaking with the past. So far, I haven't talked about buildings at all, because Art Deco really is about consumer goods. It's about commercialism and things you can bring home, like a cigarette case or a pair of earrings or a radio. But at the scale of the building and of the city, all the same things are being considered. And as a city like Manhattan changes and is now defined by the 1930s, by buildings built in the past 10 years, this reminds me of Austin today, where every time I go, there's a new building and I don't recognize the city anymore. That was New York in the 1920s, right? And so the city itself, in the way that it changed, became a spectacle that artists also were interested in drawing, printing, and painting. And I'm showing you just a couple of them here. This is my favorite over there on the left. This is a Georgia O'Keeffe, who we think of as painting natural landscapes, but she painted the city as well. This one is called City Night, and it's from 1926, right in the middle of this period of mass consumerism. 14th Street from 1924 on the right. Another Georgia O'Keeffe there on the left. This is the Radiator Building, painted in 1927, and the actual Radiator Building, which was finished just a year earlier. And so artists are responding to the immediacy of these changes in the city right away. And as the building goes up, they watch it go up, and they're fascinated by the way that it looks when it's finished. And the Radiator Building is a great example of what's changing in architecture in this period. And one of the main things that's changing is this kind of stepped ziggurat-like form, which on some level we can think of as being related to some of that exoticism and archaeology that we're talking about. You often see these referred to as ziggurat skyscrapers. But they're actually really responding to a change in zoning, of all things. Like, we all love to think about zoning code. But New York in 1916 had changed its zoning code because skyscrapers were going up across the street from each other, like the one you see in the center here, with sheer walls, right? One right across the street from the other, and they were blocking out sunlight from the streets. They were creating these kind of tunnels of wind, and so zoning code changed in order to require buildings, as you see in the diagram all the way down on the bottom left, that they had to step back away from the street the taller they got. This was to allow sunlight to shine down into the city, to allow more fresh air to get down to city streets, and to prevent that canyon effect that had begun to occur as buildings rose higher and higher as technology in the steel frame allowed them to do so. Architects couldn't figure out what to do with this zoning code. If anyone in the room is an architect, you know, like, people like zoning and code can be very frustrating. And it took a little while. Hugh Ferris, very famously, over here on the right, did a series of diagrams that were intended to explore what you could do with a building envelope and the form and the mass of a skyscraper within the context of this new zoning code. But it took a while to try to figure out what this might be. One of the first buildings that charted the new course after this 1916 zoning law passed is the one that I'm showing you here. This is a building I know really well. This is a telephone building by Ralph Walker, who I wrote a book about a few years ago. This building was built between 1921 and 1926, and it really said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a big base, and then I'm going to pull all the way back. I'm going to set back and create this twisted tower that is in contrast with the massive base below it, right? So this setback form where you're stepping away from the street became a kind of standard part of the way that skyscrapers were built in New York from that point forward. The best example of this, of course, is the Chrysler Building, which is like at the top of the surveys for people's favorite American building over and over and over again. It steps back gradually away from the street, satisfying the zoning code, and it has incredible crown at the top of the sunburst form or a crown-like form, whatever you want to call it, right? But it has that sense of energy and technology. It has a sense of exoticism, and it is very much connected to those consumer products that we're talking about as being typical for artists and architects' attention in the 20s. Obviously, it's the headquarters for a car company that chose to build their headquarters skyscraper in New York, even though their actual headquarters was back in Detroit. And they did this because New York is where the fashion was, it's where the media was, that's where the attention was, and they built this building to get attention. It was modern in a lot of ways. Modern in its construction with the steel frame here on the right, modern in its ornamentation with this radiator cap over there on the left that sat at the corners of where the building set back. And one thing I would really point out is the building is not covered in ornament from the street to the top. It's very strategically placed. The building is actually brick. I hope you can see in the photograph on the left. It's very simple, inexpensive material. The ornament is concentrated at the setbacks, so that every time you have a diminishment in the footprint of the building, you have some ornament that kind of marks that transition from one stage to the next. I love this particular point because these little hubcap-like forms and the patterns in the brick, of course, derive from the car, which is Chrysler's bread and butter. And so you're borrowing again from technology in order to create a new kind of ornament for a new kind of skyscraper. They're new materials that are, again, borrowed from industrial language and trying to make this building shiny and different from an old 19th century terracotta skyscraper. The crown of the building, those kind of hubcap ornaments are all aluminum. They're chrome, nickel, steel. The architect William Van Allen is experimenting with how to symbolically represent change. And finally, just as sometimes people are like, well, that's not a radiator cap. It's truly a radiator cap. This is an advertisement for a Chrysler here, and you can see the radiator cap here in the right of the image, and just abstracted, simplified a little bit, and popped onto the corner of the building. And finally, there is this kind of conflation of that commercial and industrial progress with a sense of patriotism. And there are eagles scattered throughout lots of Art Deco buildings. They're not just federal buildings or state buildings, but the Chrysler Building's gargoyles are eagles because they represent a kind of pride in American industry. The inside originally showcased the automobiles that were the reason for this building's being, with these circular lighting in the ceiling and in the floor. The cars had their wheels turned as if they were on a racetrack, right? There's this movement and energy and dynamism in the way the interior space is used. And this was all about, I love the caption, especially on the left, at last, the modern car style for the modern age. I just can't say this enough, that the alignment of consumer production, consumer power, consumer products, and architecture and art was all about embracing this optimistic sense of what modernity really was. So the last piece that I want to do is to bring this here to Fort Worth, because it's one thing to talk about zoning changes in New York and Chrysler wanting a capital, that kind of capital skyscraper in the capital of commerce and fashion in New York. But like, why do we have Art Deco here, right? Are we just borrowing from New York? And like on one level, maybe a little bit, but on another level, there's a story of Art Deco here in Fort Worth that's connected to those larger themes. And of course, there's industry here, there's commercialism here, and the key to understanding Art Deco in Fort Worth and in Texas in general is oil, and oil fields and the money and corporations that come here because of the oil fields. This is, of course, Jerry Bywater's very famous painting of oil field girls. That's part of the Blanton Museum of Art's collection. On the right, Photograph from, again, UTA Special Collections of the Burke-Burnett oil field. These people moving to Texas, right? Migration to this place, money, and all of the technology that's needed to extract oil from the landscape. We need planes, we need trains, we need all kinds of equipment. There's a technological change here in Texas as well. And in terms of architecture, what that means is that Cowtown is transformed. The 19th century city has to absorb these new people, is reflecting the growth of these new technologies, and Cowtown becomes a now town over the course of the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. And the architecture that does that really is Art Deco architecture. A lot of the Art Deco architecture that we have is associated with the growth of the oil industry. The railroad grows because there's a need to move more product and to move more people. So the Texas and Pacific Passenger Terminal by Wyatt Hedrick is a part of that rebuilding of a now town infrastructure in the 1920s. The Sinclair Building, associated with oil, by Wiley G. Clarkson in 1930, is another reflection. And we have these little setbacks here in Fort Worth. There's no zoning, and we don't have any canyon effects, for sure, at this point here in Fort Worth, but we are using those forms that are modern. Because corporations here in Fort Worth don't want to be 19th century corporations. They want to be modern corporations in just the same way that they are in other cities. Some of the details on the Sinclair building are, I think, really some of the best that we have here in town. And they borrow, again, some of those patterns that we've seen of ziggurats, chevron patterns, diamonds, and they use shiny metal materials, right? All of these things come to Texas. At the same time that all of the Art Deco architecture of the 20s and the 30s in Fort Worth represented the modern and the very up-to-date, by the 1970s, the 1980s, so hitting that 50-year cycle, when a building feels a little worn, feels a little bit like it needs some TLC, at that 50-year mark, some things start to change in the way that Art Deco buildings are perceived in Fort Worth. And this is where the photographs that you see here on the wall that have been really wonderfully put together by Cheryl Mitchell and her class and students. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the Cohen family for donating all of these photographs and other research materials to UTA Special Collections so that they continue to be used by new generations of students and researchers. But those photographs taken in the 70s and in the 80s really became part of a much larger campaign to teach people to reconnect with what Art Deco had been about in the first place. This is an article from 1981 that Judy Cohen wrote for the Star-Telegram, kind of reminding people that this 50-year-old building actually is not just a worn-out place, but it's something really special, and that represents a story that maybe people have just forgotten. The idea of thinking about what to do with these older Art Deco buildings really connected to collaboration amongst many, many, many different people, but especially with the demolition of the aviation building in 1978. And I'm like, is the aviation building on the wall here? It's not? Oh, okay. But the aviation building's demolition in 1978 really galvanized community in Fort Worth to be much more direct and begin to advocate for saving Art Deco architecture. And so the book, Cowtown Modern, from 1988, kind of represented the culmination of this decade-long research process, writing process, collaborative process, in which the documentation of those Art Deco buildings, as well as creating a narrative and storytelling about their importance, came to fruition. This is an event that was at that T&P warehouse in 1988, and they're actually a really wonderful collection of photographs of this event. And I don't know if anyone has reached out to have people identify themselves in these photographs, but I'm just standing here thinking about it, and like we should have people do that. But this is a moment of collaboration, right? Where groups came together, AIA, historic preservation groups, people from many different parts of the city, to really address an issue that was important. So the last piece that I would like to think about is I've kind of set up this idea that the Art Deco of the 1920s was Nowtown. But when we think about that period now, because it's in the past, it seems to be lumped into this Cowtown idea that seems to be more current. And I'll try to explain that a little bit. And if it's not clear to you, just grab me afterwards and I'll try to explain it again. But as a historian, I have a lot of questions about the way that we think about Art Deco now in 2023, especially because we seem to be building new buildings that are trying to look like Art Deco buildings a lot in the past couple of decades. And as somebody who's really interested in preservation, it feels sometimes like we build new Art Deco buildings instead of investing in the Art Deco buildings that are actually from the 20s and 30s. And this feels like a kind of false choice that we're having to make. And so between Cowtown and Nowtown, and obviously this is Sundance Square with a building that wants you to think it's Art Deco, but clearly is not. And I always say, the materials are different, the technology is different. Everything that I just talked about having to do with Art Deco in the 20s is not present. Right? Art Deco in the 20s was cutting edge, nothing like it had ever been seen before. It was not nostalgic. It was breaking with the past intentionally. And when we build Art Deco today, that's not what we're doing. We're actually connecting ourselves and repeating the past. And I think it raises some kind of key questions like, what's Cowtown, what's Nowtown? Are we honoring the past when we imitate it? I'm not sure. I'm not going to answer that question. But I think it's one that needs to be asked. And what that leaves us with is a lot of brand new Art Deco-ish buildings, but the buildings from the 20s themselves being listed on the most endangered list repeatedly, because we still find ourselves in this place where investment in the kind of vision of what the 20s and 30s at its most optimistic was supposed to be about, seems to kind of push and pull as to Nowtown and Cowtown. And I'll just go and mention, of course, Farrington Fields is in that same category. And both buildings here are in this section here on the right. You can get a little closer and see some of those details. And I have a sense in conversations that I've had that some people I've talked to are like, oh, no, we don't need to worry about those because we have something like the Dickies Arena, which fills in for it. Which, it feels more like nostalgia than it does like actual Art Deco. And the same when you think about the contrast here between the Cowgirl Museum, which is a really wonderful institution, and the Community Arts Center, which was Nowtown. Just in the way that Art Deco was in the 20s, was Nowtown. This building was Nowtown. And we now have kind of trouble reconciling those two visions of what the city is supposed to be about. Right? As a historian, I really love architecture that's about Nowtown. And this is an example, again, photographed by Don Cohen. This is a telephone building, so I especially like this one. But the lintel over the doorway is this really incredible cast stone hypothetical city lined on either side by these wonderful buildings and this incredible radiating sun that I hope is not 110 degrees, but you never know. This was Nowtown, right? This Art Deco building, embracing technology, using the telephone building to tell a story about a new city that was emerging. And this guy was Nowtown too. In the 20s, cattle was an important part of the economy. It was a huge part of the economy. This is one of my favorite things in the entire city of Fort Worth, actually, there on the Lancaster Bridge. But cattle's not really the same piece of our economy here in Fort Worth anymore. And so when we think about the imagery of Art Deco, what it was about in the 20s versus the way that we think about it now, the question that I would leave for everyone is where do you place nostalgia versus preservation, imitation versus understanding Art Deco as an expression of a very particular moment in American history. And I think that the work that Judy Cohen did in the 80s, along with many other people in this room, was emblematic of the energy that's needed to try to tell a story in a really compelling way. And I think that we can do that too. And that's the message that I would leave all of you with. Thank you for this opportunity. Again, I look forward to celebrating all of the preservation winners tonight, and catch me if you have no idea what I was just talking about.